Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for coming today also from my side. So as Mikkel already said, today I will present our idea for a EU-African skill partnership. But first of all, I will try to focus on the recent development of regular and irregular migration from Africa to the EU, trying to compare it also from what we can see in the experience between Mexico and the US, in order to draw some conclusion on which kind of policies have been implemented over there and have been successful in curbing irregular migration. So in this slide, you can see the number of first-time residence permits issued by the EU to third country national, and on the left-hand side, you have the focus on African citizens. You can see that since 2009, the category among the four that have been decreasing the most is the one for remunerated activities, so for work purposes, while the other four categories has been rather constant over the years. This has not been the case instead for other third country nationals. So it appears there's been a closing on legal opportunities for work migration for African citizens. If on the one side we have seen a decrease in work permits since 2010 for citizens from Africa, we have seen also an increase, substantial increase since 2013 in the number of irregular crossing. And if for the Africa and the EU case, we have quite limited time span, for the case of the Mexico and the US, instead, we can observe such trends at different points in times. And we can see on the graphs on the right-hand side that substitution between regular and irregular migration has taken place between Mexico and the US in two different periods. The first one between 1955 and 65, and the second part more recently since early 2000. And in brief, what happened in these two periods is that a mix of policies was put in place by the US, where on the one hand we had an increase in legal opportunities for work migration for Mexican workers, as well as some facilitation for employers in the US, meaning, for example, in 1955 it was allowed to rehire Mexican workers under the Bracero programs, while before in the first part of the program, workers were obliged to go back in Mexico and then reapply for the program. This, of course, was increasing possibilities for hiring irregular migrants in the US. This action was also supported on the other side by an increase in enforcement of migration legislation in terms of, for example, carry out returns vis-a-vis with Mexico, and increasing also check for employers and border control. What we see instead in the periods between 1965, so termination of the Bracero program, and early 2000 is instead a significant increase in irregular crossing, which is over the same periods when the US tried to increase border control quite significantly. So what we can see and which conclusion can be drawn from this experience is that the US was successful in curbing irregular migration while substituting for more regular opportunities when there was such a mix of policies, so by adopting a more holistic approach. And it was necessary to have a sufficient scope on the one side for legal opportunities, but on the other was necessary also to step up enforcement of migration legislation. In order also to achieve this mix of policies and to have them successful in curbing irregular migration, it's necessary to have cooperation with origin countries, for example, for enforcing returns. And for the case instead of the EU, it will be also necessary to have strong cooperation within EU countries to be more credible vis-a-vis with our partners. So within this framework is that we think that the EU-Africa skill partnership could be of value added for the EU when going to negotiate with African partners on increasing opportunities for legal migration, as well as increasing cooperation from our partners. And the key aspect, as Mikkel already said in the introduction, is that in a skill partnership, the aim is to train more people that will eventually migrate, so to try to increase the development impact of such a tool. This is possible because training will be carried out in the origin country, so at considerably lower cost than at destination, and this will increase not only human capital, but also capacity building in the origin countries. So such a skill partnership would have a more long-term approach than other measures applied so far by the EU. And we also argue that for the specific case of EU-Africa, there is a strong case indeed for within EU cooperation, because even though access to member state territories, of course, competence of member state, irregular migration is an issue that is affecting the EU as a whole. And as said, the scope of offers made is important when it comes to successfully curb irregular migration. So an EU-wide offers would increase bargaining power of the EU vis-a-vis with African countries, and of course increase also the credibility of our commitments in terms of permits that we would pledge. So really briefly, which kind of setup this scheme could have. So as I already said, member states have full competence of member state to decide the number of permits, so they must be the one first to identify shortages in their own labor markets and pledge the number of permits. Then there will be the European Commission that could act as a coordinator, so meaning trying to find synergies among these offers, and as well as coordinating implementation of the project on the ground in origin countries. We think that a framework similar to the one adopted for the EU resettlement scheme could also be applied in this context. So we would have element of voluntary participation of member states, and central financing from the EU budget, and finally a steering committee led by the European Commission to overview implementation of projects. And as said before, it's important to think both size and scope of such trainings in relation to labor markets, both at destination and origin, because skills developed must be applied and must be spendable in both labor markets. Otherwise, the development aspect of such skill partnership will not be significant. I will then conclude with an example that we found that we think there could be room for cooperation between countries in the EU and Africa. And we know from the EU labor force survey that there is a consistent shortage of sheets and structural metal workers in the EU, and that this labor force is low-medium skill, and the same lack of qualified workers is also observed in countries like Tunisia and Egypt. So we believe that in such a sector there is a common interest of both origin and destination countries in increasing a similar set of skills that could be applied in both labor markets. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a little dark. I hope that you can see it. I will describe it so vividly that you won't need to see it. Thank you so much. There's a very basic question on the screen. I think it's a profound question, and it's what I want to ask, which is what is migration regulation? Who are people who regulate migration? And eventually I want to convince you that people on this stage are involved directly in regulating migration. Because I think we need a bigger definition of what that is. And I want to look for answers to that question to a specific man whose story I talk about, because I think it's important to be concrete about who and what we're talking about. This is September 9th, 2012. People living in a part of West London called Mortlake heard a loud noise in the street in the morning. They looked out to find a dead man on the sidewalk with a gaping head wound. And it took weeks to figure out that he hadn't actually been killed on the street. He had fallen from a plane. He had hidden himself in the landing gear compartment of a British Airways flight out of Angola. And that flight on its eastern approach to Heathrow had its landing gear open, and he fell out. this is what he looked like in life. It's a grainy cell phone video, the best picture I could find. His name was José Matada. He was originally from Mozambique. He had died on his 27th birthday. Now, I think you can already tell that the first answer, I think we could look to José Matada for this question of, well, what is migration regulation? Is migration regulation simply the enforcement of laws? Is it something that the guy at the airport checking your passport or people in boats in the Mediterranean do? That's migration regulation. There are some people so motivated to improve their lives that I claim, and this is a controversial claim, I claim that there are not a set of things that we could do that are compatible with with open democratic societies and with our shared humanity with Africans that would deter all of them. And I think that this act, which is really unimaginable for me to take in my own life, symbolizes that. I think that border enforcement is critical and necessary and should continue and should even be strengthened. But I think José Matada's story and the story of millions of other people suggest that it's very, very far from sufficient if our goal is to regulate migration. Now, in development agencies, where some of this panel works, a popular and important second answer to that question of what is migration regulation right now involves development assistance, addressing the root causes of migration, make it so that José Matada never needed to stow away in a landing gear compartment to improve his life because he could have found ample opportunities in Mozambique. That's incredibly important work. I think that in the long term, there is strong evidence that could be effective. But in the long term, I'm not talking about a span of time that goes beyond our lives. That should be considered to be on the scale of a century or more. And here's what I'm talking about. This is the relationship between development measured by income per capita and immigration across countries right now. So the horizontal axis is real income per capita on a logarithmic scale. The vertical axis is the fraction of each country's, the fraction of the people born in each country who live in any other country, who have emigrated to anywhere else. And the solid line is the simple average across countries, and the dotted lines are an interval of statistical confidence. So just looking across countries, the far left of that graph is low-income countries, defined by the World Bank, Mali, Malawi. The middle of that graph, at the top of that hump, are countries, middle-income countries like Tunisia, Albania. And in the transition from low-income to high-income, after which you can see migration typically goes down, as we might expect. In that transition from low-income to middle-income, migration doesn't fall. It doesn't even rise a little. It triples on average, with a lot of variance. Triples. Here's the same relationship for child mortality. It's the same graph, but the horizontal axis now is the survival of children. So going to the right is a greater and greater fraction of children born alive making it to age 5 without dying. 80%, you can see 90%, and this is a logarithmic scale, so then 99%. Immigration, the fraction of across countries, the fraction of people born in each country living outside that country rises and rises and rises with child survival. And I think this is tremendously counterintuitive to people when they first encounter this evidence. Does this mean that people prefer to stay in places that are poor and where their children are more likely to die? It doesn't mean anything like that. And I think the best way to get an intuitive sense of this is to look at history, specifically European history. So this is the gross emigration rate from Sweden at each decade between 1850 and 1930. And the question is, why did 1/5 of Sweden leave Sweden permanently during that time period? Was that the time that development failed in Sweden? Was this the time that Sweden collapsed into poverty and insecurity? exactly the opposite. This is the moment that Sweden emerged into modern economic development. And we can intuitively understand the reasons for this surge. Principal among them was a demographic transition. It was in the 1860s, 1870s that child mortality started to collapse in Sweden. That is typically followed by a fall in fertility, but after a substantial interval, which means a surge of young people into the labor market looking for work. It involves transitions in rural-urban dynamics. It involves an increase in inequality. It involves rising human capital, which changes not just the ability to migrate, but aspirations to migrate. It involves even things as mundane as rising disposable income, making it easier to pay the passage. All of which, and many other factors in a complex way, encourage migration during the transition into middle income. And it's only after that that things start to be more intuitive for us. This is the second lesson of José Matada. You could think of him as a poster child for this phenomenon. He was born in Mozambique in the 1980s. That is when child mortality started to collapse in Mozambique. In other words, one way to think of why he was there in 2012 to get into a landing gear compartment is that he didn't die as a child. And that is an echo of a massive development success across Africa, which is that not just in Mozambique, but across almost all of sub-Saharan Africa, child mortality has collapsed over the last several decades due to the success of development efforts, particularly in public health. So when people talk about scary demographic numbers, 800 million new additional labor force participants in sub-Saharan Africa by 2050. That's the net increase, not the number of people entering the labor force, the net increase in the size of the labor force of sub-Saharan Africa, 800 million people, 20 times the current labor force of Germany, is the increase in sub-Saharan Africa over the next 30 years. That's a sign of development success. That is a result of the development success of sub-Saharan Africa. It is not a sign of development failure, and the migration pressures that are associated with it are likewise a sign of development success. I want to, yeah, this is not easy to see, and I apologize for that. But you saw this same graph from Mattia earlier, so you can remember that vivid impression it left in your mind. This is in green, as Mattia pointed out, at the US-Mexico border, the number of seasonal work visas, lawful work visas given to Mexicans to cross and do mostly agricultural work, although in sometimes it was railroad work, and other times some of it was in seasonal hotels and seasonal restaurants. In red is the number of apprehensions of oh, thank you so much, that's much better. In red is the number of apprehensions, and that's on the right-hand y-axis, of Mexicans, not Central Americans or others, of Mexicans at the US border. And not only, as Mattia pointed out, there is an inverse relationship among these things, but I want to point out that there are two huge humps there in just the total amount of migration that was going on. One was basically in the 1950s, the other is in the 1980s and 90s. Those were driven by vast forces that had not much to do with policy. In the 1950s was the first time in US history that the size of the youth cohort in the labor force shrank, not just grew slowly, but actually contracted, because 20 years earlier in the Great Depression, people stopped having children. And in the 80s and 90s, it shrank again, the only other time that's happened in US history, and shrank a lot more. And that's because the baby boomers were aging out of the youth cohorts and leaving a giant hole in the youth portion of the labor force. At the same time, Mexico in the 80s and 90s was cresting in its demographic wave. That was the peak of the surge of people who didn't die as children before fertility declined in Mexico. Those are the principal determinants of those two humps. As you can see, policy is what shaped the terms on which they happened. And it wasn't just a matter of there being more visas in the 1950s and more visas recently. As Mattia pointed out, it was a combination of an extraordinary crackdown on enforcement after 1954, before which you can see a peak of illegal migration accompanying those visas that really combined with the lawful channels that shaped this flow. The flow was determined by forces way beyond policy, and I think inaccessible to policy to massively change. But the nature of the migration was changed through the existence of lawful channels combined with necessary enforcement efforts. And this is where I think we can learn, draw a third lesson from José Matada. Was there an opportunity that was lost there? He died. It was a tragedy for his family. I would claim that it's a loss to us, that it's a lost opportunity to invest in human capital. And I mean that seriously. I have never done anything remotely as brave as get into that landing gear compartment. If you stop for a second and consider the just native human energy and courage and dynamism it would take to interrupt your life to such a degree and take such an action. Imagine if those natural talents were shaped for military service, for entrepreneurship, even for aggressive sales in a corporation. Those are things that could have been beneficial to you and me, and they were wasted when he fell out of a plane. Is there a way that the 800 million, some of the 800 million new workers in sub-Saharan Africa could be a resource rather than just a threat, something to be contained by enforcement and development efforts? This is where I think that just an enormous amount of opportunity for innovation lies. And just to clarify two things, absolutely not instead of enforcement and development efforts. I mean that those things José Matada teaches us are not sufficient. Absolutely necessary, absolutely important, just not sufficient to the magnitude of the challenge. And in addition to that, the example of global skill partnerships, I think, is a very interesting one, but it is by no stretch of the imagination the programs of this kind are the answer to the challenge or the thing that is missing. To me, what is missing is innovation in ways to shape migration in ways that are mutually beneficial, above and beyond the two other components of stopping it with enforcement and development assistance. So just to talk briefly about global skill partnerships, if I have a few minutes, I'll define it with an example, hypothetical example between Germany and Morocco here. A global skill partnership is a bilateral agreement between two countries. It is a public-private partnership in both countries, a migrant destination country and a migrant origin country, and it's fundamentally an exchange. The country of migrant origin agrees to facilitate training for potential migrants before they leave in skills that are immediately needed by, specific skills that are immediately needed by employers in the destination. And in return, the destination country provides technology transfer and finance for the training not only of those people, but for non-migrants as well. That's it. If we consider a hypothetical example in nursing, although it could be done in many different sectors, everybody involved in this equation can benefit if the very hard work of designing it properly can be executed. Germany can get workers that it needs with the exact qualifications, not just more nurses, but for example, more nurses who are willing to work graveyard shift, who have specialty training in dementia care, which is a real example of an extreme shortage in southern Germany. They get affordable training. Training in Morocco for nurses and nearly any professional is drastically cheaper than it is in Germany. They get a clear and easy recruitment pipeline, so they don't need to face the challenge of wading into Morocco and trying to find workers on their own. Workers themselves get amazing professional opportunities, hundreds of % increase in earnings, and free training. That is, the programs can be designed so they're accessible to anybody, including the poor. And Morocco, which, like many countries in Africa, has a high and legitimate suspicion of any programs of this kind for skilled migration, for several reasons that include that it often comes with a fiscal drain and a human capital drain, gets no fiscal drain because the people benefiting from the training of these workers are paying for it. They get more nurses because these programs are bundled with training for non-migrants as well. They get stronger training institutions. they might get remittances, and I want to add that all of these accrue even if there's zero return migration. So if there is also return migration and circularity, that could provide additional benefits, but everything I've said is designed around a concept of permanent migration. And if we think about the demographic balances here, I think we need to be discussing far beyond purely circular migration, because these are structural and long-term changes that will be, in part, de facto addressed by permanent migration. I want to close. I want to point out that the José Matada of 10 years from now is a teenager right now. And the question is whether regulating the potential migration of that person is going to be sufficiently performed by purely enforcement or purely development assistance efforts. I think the answer is that as important, as critically important as those are, the answer is no. That we can only serve the proper regulation of the movement of people like him by investing right now in innovating, designing new tools, and many, many others besides this one. And I'm so excited to be on the stage with people like Rafaela and Tilman, who are actively involved in doing that. They sit in development agencies. And not by coincidence, only development agencies can do this sort of work. If there's to be coordination in training in human capital investment with countries of origin to make migration better for everybody involved, I don't know of another genre of organization that we have that can do this work. And it's global leadership. It's something that I admire greatly in the face of very strong political headwinds. And I hope we can learn more from them about what they have been learning. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mattia and Michael, for these two excellent presentations. I suggest that instead of taking questions right away, we take a round with the panel first. I suggest that each panelist spend 3 minutes, not much more than 4 minutes. That's not a lot, but we need to get a round of Q&A, and we'll get back to the different issues. And I would like to ask Tilman and Rafaela, this is a bit unprepared, I know, but to tell us a tiny bit more which challenges there are when you take these ideas to the field. I would like you, Michael, and you, Marta, to talk a tiny bit more about these innovations you talked about. For you, Marta, it's of course completely unprepared, I realize, but I imagine that you have words to say on this. So if you would spend 3-4 minutes expanding slightly on what you have in mind to the extent that's possible. Alexander, I would like to hear from you. I'm tempted to say the Commission's view, but that's what we always say. I would like to hear from you how you see this from the Commission side. How does this relate to the pilot projects that we have heard a lot about, but then again haven't heard a lot about? So if you can do that in 3-4 minutes. And I suggest we just start from the end here with you, Tilman, if you're fine with that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. It's always exciting to change the program of the discussion. Well, I'm afraid I have to tell you that I'm the only one on this panel who is not a migration expert, as Michael has nicely introduced. I'm coming from the education and labor market side of the story, and I'm very happy to share with you some experience of our concrete work where we have already tried to implement programs which might be put under the title of skill partnerships. Actually, it was around 8 to 10 years ago that we realized that most of the existing programs were very much focused on labor migration of academic people. So when the first discussions in Europe came up that there, according to the demographic situation, there will be huge challenges on some of the labor markets, we realized that the challenges will very much also be on the non-academic labor market. And this is exactly where we found the idea very interesting to combine these issues on the European labor market with a development perspective. And of course, as Michael has mentioned in his presentation, we as a development organization can benefit from the networks that we already have. So GIZ is implementing projects in the area of skills development and employment promotion in 60 countries around the world. So we have a huge network with training providers, with public employment services, with ministries of education and labor in a series of countries. And at the same time, we have experience with public-private partnership projects. When it comes to public-private partnership, it is extremely important that it does not mean that the public sector is paying and the private sector is taking the gain, but to identify a scheme where the private sector can also contribute financially. And this was the starting point where we said, where is the biggest pressure on the German labor market? And not by chance, it was actually the area of nursing, of healthcare services, where we found a lot of German hospitals who were ready to invest in such a project. On the other hand, we had a close look at the situation in the partner countries, and we tried to develop a set of criteria in order to identify the right partners for this project. First of all, in the area of healthcare, there is this famous list from the World Health Organization, where you can find data about the availability of skilled labor in the respective countries. So of course, we did not want to contradict programs that were meant to support the health systems within the countries. And so this first step already reduced the list of potential countries for such a cooperation tremendously. Second, we tried to identify in which countries we have strong partners from public employment services in order to really reach out to the target group. We had a look at the governance situation, at anti-corruption schemes in order to make sure that such an approach can be well balanced. And we had a look at existing migration schemes, to what extent countries already look at labor export as a strategy for their within their employment policy. And at the end of this exercise, we ended up with 3 to 4 countries that were or that fulfilled this criteria. These were Serbia, Vietnam, the Philippines, and to some extent Bosnia and Herzegovina. So as you can already see, we are not yet talking about countries from the African continent. And this has a lot to do with the level of the skills development systems in the countries. So I might speak a little bit more about the situation in the African continent later. But the biggest issue is how to bring together the level of qualification between the countries. And for example, in Vietnam, we have started an initial training for nurses in Vietnam, where the nurses can choose between a so-called home track in order to really work in Vietnamese hospitals with a higher level of skills, or to choose an abroad track where they, from the beginning on, would also follow German language courses and courses about the specific needs within German hospitals, which are different from the Vietnamese ones. And after this initial training, the Vietnamese nurses were allowed to, and this is very important, were allowed to enter into the German apprenticeship system. So they were not yet on the level to enter into the German labor market, but to enter into the German apprenticeship system. And the benefit was that they could start 1 year later. So that means they had a reduction of the apprenticeship time of 1 year in Germany. But still, I mean, this, I think, shows already very well that there is a lot of investment needed if you really want to bring people to the level that which is needed for the European labor market. And, well, if you try to generalize a little bit the experience from this approach, I would say there are 3 main elements you have to look at. The first one are really the systems in the countries. As I mentioned, the governance, but also the employment system, the education system, the level of skills that you have. The second one is that you have a clear look at the labor demand on the European labor markets. According to our experience, it is not enough just to say that there is a lack of labor. I mean, it is still a big difference if you, as an employer, have to invest in such an approach where you do not just pay for the apprenticeship, but also for language courses, also for the arrival in Europe with all the assistance services which are needed for the arrivals. And this is not yet the case in many sectors in Europe. So for the healthcare sector, we discovered that there is not a lack of a labor force, but there is really an emergency. And this is why the employers were ready to invest in such an approach. And the last element, which is very important from our development perspective, is that such approaches to really invest into the skills development systems in the countries of origin have to be adapted to the existing skills development schemes. Otherwise, you will just create isolated islands which will never be able to, or which will never be sustainable, let's say it this way.
One thing, if I may add, which I think you said between the lines, sorry, I'll just speak without mic, is that I think what you also said is that developing these things are not, maybe not for all countries on the receiving side, that there actually needs to be a quite elaborate infrastructure in the receiving country also to accommodate newcomers and skilled people. Marta, can I give the word to you?
Thank you. Okay, let me say a couple of things about innovation then, as you asked. I've got 3 proposals on how we make the most of innovation. And what I mean by making the most, some of it is, yes, have an impact, have saving lives or creating jobs. But a lot of it is actually creating the opportunities to make some progress in what is, I think, today a politically very sour debate where nobody knows where to look for some progress. I think here the job is one of creating, being politically smart and seize opportunities where they exist to actually get out of this stalemate that the debate on migration, certainly in Europe, has found itself into. So the first, at the sound of being controversial, given that the title of this is What Role for Skills Partnership in EU Migration Policy, I would say that the potential of innovation of this model does not sit easily with EU-wide policy and approaches. So in other words, it seems to me that this idea responds to a real need in Europe that I am not convinced is necessarily best addressed solely through trying the route of an EU-wide coordinated effort across the member states. And at the sound of being controversial, it seems to me that it's partly because of how EU policymaking works, where the limits of these approaches in the past also, where I think rather this kind of, and it's not, I mean, the Global Skills Partnership is just one example of innovation. There can be many others that fundamentally try to better match the needs of labor markets with the reality of human aspirations and human mobility. I think these kind of ideas work well, as we've heard, through a series of, say, bilateral arrangements, which is a classic way of implementing this work. We're probably going to hear soon about what Belgium has done with Morocco, and we just heard from Germany. It seems to me that it lends itself to groups of countries that share some similar characteristic. Michael showed very effectively how the demographic trends in countries of destination or host countries affects migration, where there are youth, decline in labor availability in countries of destination. Well, across Europe, that demographic trends are very variable. I mean, countries have very different experiences in terms of their labor markets and what they need. The two countries I'm most familiar with, where I'm from, Italy, and the UK, where I live, have very different trends when it comes to demographic trends and needs of labor. So I think it's likely that there are countries that share some of these characteristics in their labor market, where they can engage in a coalition to implement and to innovate through global skills partnership. The other model could be one more based on industry. I mean, we just heard about nurses. I mean, there may be some specific industry across a number of countries where there is some real potential to seize this opportunity. That may or may not apply to the EU 27 or 28, depends. Don't know what the latest news is from London. But we all know that within the member states at the moment, there are some member states that are likely not to cooperate and to stall innovation. So it doesn't mean to say that you do not want to look at it from an EU perspective, but I think you want to make sure that you have champions in particular member states, in particular industries that can make some pragmatic progress alongside a more, a multilateral approach to this. And the idea of champions is key. I mean, Germany and Belgium are two examples. There might be some interesting opportunities in the UK opening up soon, where as a result, by a funny twist of events with Brexit, now the UK needs to attract new talent. Global Britain needs fresh blood, from outside of Europe, and is about to implement, or will one day implement, new immigration policies. They may well, benefit from innovation of this kind by trying to attract talent that otherwise will before come naturally from the EU. The second point is that on this kind of innovation, often very early on, as we experiment with it, somebody comes in and says, yet but scale. Where are the opportunities? How, we just heard in the conversation over lunch the sheer numbers of the demographic bulge in Africa and how many jobs are needed for the young populations from Africa today and in the future. Obviously, the Global Skills Partnership is not the solution to all of that. None of these things ever will. But I think it would be such a mistake to not make the most of the innovative potential of the design and the mechanisms and the experiments that can be done with the basic idea. And here, one thing I've learned about Germany a couple of weeks ago is that the way the experiment is working in Germany is in the context of national policies and legislation that, having acknowledged the skills gaps and demographic trends, is actively pursuing a different approach to immigration that tries to attract talent from different countries. And within that, the idea that the development cooperation agency has a particular role to play in its relationship, in the case of, I think Kosovo and some other countries that Germany has been working with, to implement the Global Skills Partnership. So to me, the design innovation there is when you get away from the idea that Germany is a country that gives money to Kosovo or other countries in this world as part of its aid policies, and has a coherent set of policies that tries to address the needs of Germany and the needs of the origin countries. And to me, around that design that tries to make these things work in a way that is a mutual benefit in a policy area where the dominant narrative remains that there is a rich country that has money that gets sent to a poor country where migrants are from, with an attempt to stop migrants coming their way. So this is a fundamental shift in thinking that I think is as important as one that looks at scale. And the third and last point is that in so much migration debate and in so much aid and development debate for that matter, we fall back into this dichotomy between a country of origin and a country of destination, a donor country and a recipient country. I think with this we need to go a little bit further and think of all the countries in between that stand to benefit of this approach. And what I'm thinking of, rather than applying this idea to two countries, a bit like you showed, one being the rich country of destination in Europe and one being, in this case, a poorer country of origin, potentially in Africa somewhere. What about all the countries, for example, within Africa, where there are genuine work, labor market needs, and where migrants of different kinds can find work, and it could benefit from being trained in those countries rather than necessarily move on through, dangerous routes or to find work elsewhere. So this idea of countries, and particularly emerging economies, middle-income countries, they're often on the routes of major migration flows, or is where a lot of a lot of migrants within different continents stay. And I know that in Africa it might be different in different parts of the world, but we know that so much movement is regional. And so is there a way, is there a version, an adaptation of the model that imagines that a country like Germany, the UK, invests some money, not just in a country of origin necessarily, but as part of a strategic investment in Nigeria, in Ghana, in other parts of Africa, for example, that there is an element of it that is, that is also aimed at strengthening the skills of the labor force in that country. They may well be migrant labor force in a way that ultimately benefits the migrants in those countries, as well as the UK in its, or Germany in its development policies. And the very last point on that, I really appreciate what you say, Michael, about the rural development agencies, because nobody else can do it. And we also know that there is a bit of a moment of opportunity with ODA being made available to, for this kind of policies and issues, which I think is a great opportunity that we simply didn't have not that long ago, because we were going to the Belgian Development Agency a few years ago and we said we just don't do migration, because migration is almost the ultimate failure of development, as you explained. I do think that's a limitation. I think we need to be very aware that so much of the dominant rhetoric in the development space, which is, and I know it because I work in there, is still so much aid-centric, and that's quite difficult to combine with some of the ideas in this. So it's fundamental that alongside the development agencies, the IKEA of this world, the multilateral development banks, particularly the regional ones that work on economic development and infrastructures, the private sectors, as we heard, come along as partners in this in ways that maximizes the element of it that can be ODA in a way that can genuinely break away from the notion that there is a country that gives some money to a poor country so that people either stay where they are or come our way, which politically in so many national parliaments creates such tensions. So here we go.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, sorry, we should consistently. Thanks a lot, Marta. I think I was the first one in the room to mention scale, so I think I should take that point on board. I do think, though, that given also the numbers that Michael brought up, that one will have to think about scale somehow. And the other point that we will certainly, Mattia and I will take on board is the kind of silver bullet thinking, of course, which I completely agree with. On the other point, I think we can get back to some of them in Q&A. I think we can just move along with the list of speakers and give the word to you, Michael, if you, or would you rather pass it and wait? Yeah, maybe let's go to Rafaela then.
I heard a lot from me, but later on
Okay.
So thank you very much. All that you said resonates so much with the many things I would like to say that 3 minutes will never be enough. So I go by bullet, and then not silver bullet, but bullet points, and then you will tell me if we need more. Indeed, Belgium, if you just change Germany with Belgium, this is exactly the idea we have tried to put together following your ideas. And the basics of it was partnership. Partnering with Moroccan and Belgian institutions first, but private sector immediately after. And I will introduce to you the idea that we've developed with the Director General of the Moroccan National Employment and Professional Training Agency. We need to build a quadripartite partnership, the quadripartite being composed by National Employment Agency from Morocco, National or Regional Employment Agency from Belgium, in this specific case, Flanders, Chamber of Commerce, Confédération Générale des Entreprises Marocaines, Morocco, Chamber of Commerce, specific region in Belgium, Flanders. And these four partners together, no more south, no more north, but these four partners together invent a new migration concertée, a new way to look at possible mobility. So we start from the partnership. Why do we start from this quadripartite partnership? Because we identify needs. We identify needs which are exactly the same in Morocco and in Flanders. When I say exactly the same, you need to take me by the words. Exactly the same. Do we need codeur? In Flanders, yes. Do we need codeur? In Morocco, yes. Do we need testeur? In Flanders, yes. Don't ask me to say it in Flemish. I will study 2 years and then I tell you. But do we need codeur In Morocco, yes, and so on and so forth. So identifying skills profile, there are so much needed in Flanders, so much needed in Morocco, training in Morocco through Moroccan service provider, following skills and training, professional training that exist through actors, operators that exist in Morocco and that works with the National Employment Agency in Morocco without duplicating, without creating satellite and island that will never stand once a project implemented thanks to the willingness of the European institution to support member states, the engagement of member states. Where does it come, the engagement of member states? And there is where the quadripartite idea is particularly interesting to me. From the private sector, regional employment agency, where is development? And why am I here and not the representative of the regional employment agency from Flanders? Because this quadripartite cooperation and partnership was put together and started to exist as such, as a partnership, because a development agency said, oh, but we have a good idea to implement this partnership and to make sure that there is a strong development impact for this partnership. And why it is so? Because these needs that are exactly the same in Flanders and in Morocco, they have been stated by authorities in Flanders and in Morocco. They were not talking to each other. So we can put them to talk together, and we can put individuals to talk together, and we can make sure that there are enterprises in Belgium and enterprises in Morocco, so labor market in Belgium, labor market in Morocco, that is eager to support the training and to employ those that will be trained. And who are, and here are the six-partite partnership in Belgium and in Morocco, and who are those who will be trained? Not the ICT skill, not the ICT qualified youngsters that exist in Morocco very much. The level of qualifications for ICT potential workers or workers in Morocco is relatively high, and it could fit the European labor market as it fits the Canadian and the US labor market and even the French labor market already. So are you looking at those? No. The partnership is composed because, and here is again where the development components come in, we are looking at the potential, at the talents of those that can become qualified ICT workers in Morocco and in Flanders that meet the minimum criteria for the legal framework, for the migration legal framework in Belgium, c'est-à-dire Bac+2, according to the next law just approved last December in Flanders and entered into force as from 1st of January, but this doesn't need to be in the ICT sector. This can be in any other sector, possibly a scientific one, but wow, talking to Belgian enterprises and talking to Moroccan enterprises via the members of the quadripartite partnership, we discovered that enterprises are much more interested in capacities and skills than on papers, qualification. That's perfect. All the elements of the partnership are getting together. So the potential, the willingness to be employed, the willingness to travel, yes, but not necessarily, because open doors will be open also in the ground in Morocco, making sure that the circle is such and that all the elements are there. One small part, because I know that 3 minutes are over, which is important alongside with the recognition that there is a market need, there is a labor market need. And now I will show off a knelpunt beroepen, a study done by the private sector together with the regional employment authority, together with the Bureau Fédéral du Plan at Flemish level, same at Moroccan level, that acknowledges a need, a capacity to absorb, a willingness to train, a capacity of local training service provider to train in Morocco and to train a sufficient pool of workers that can go and that can stay, a legal framework that allows people with a bac plus 2, not necessarily in ICT, to come, and the administrative machine that is able to follow this through. And this is not only an attempt to implement the Global Skills Partnership, the champions, putting Belgium in front as a champion, implementing the Global Skills Partnership, but also testing the new institutional setting that with the 6th reform of the states in Belgium places labor migration from the federal to the regional level of competencies, and in the meantime, the entering into force of the single permit directive. So it is not only innovative in the development sense and in the skill sense, but also in the institutional sense. And there is where I think that Belgium, like Germany, and those who try can stand as a champion, because you can also change your regulation system in order to implement innovative models, innovative practices. And we are just starting. It took almost 1 year to constitute the quadripartite partnership, to identify labor market needs, to identify ways forward. So I hope that we will be here in 1 year time, 2 years time, to see how it goes. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Raffaella. We'll definitely invite you back in 2 years' time. So, listening to you and having listened to Tilman, both of you listed so many conditions. No, Tilman, there was a selection of countries, partners, so on. You said that all the things you have to do to build what I guess is a genuine partnership, no, where you. So my question to you, Alexandra, would be, what can the Commission do in this large chain of events to make a success out of skill partnership? So please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, just as an entry point, I would like to say that we came into this discussion on skills partnership and how to support member states to do it quite recently, like 1 year and a half ago. Notably because although we have a full body of legislation on legal migration now, linking it to the issue how to regulate migration, so a body of legislation at EU level that we implement, this legislation is like something unilateral that we offer unilaterally because for different reasons, and in the last 20 years we developed based on several principles that we consider very close to the hearts of Europeans, like equal treatment, the fight against exploitation, the opportunities that are offered for people to come to Europe and use the internal market. So this kind of, and also the need for new ideas, new people to be able to contribute to the competitiveness and development of Europe. So we have this body of legislation that is there, some quite recent, some a bit older, but this is offered unilaterally. So it's something that we apply. We will find it out more in detail now after Brexit, because it's something that we offer to all third countries. It's not linked at all with specific management of migration or with flows with third countries. So it's not something that we say we are offering the entry of students only to people from Ghana. No, it's something, the rules are there to facilitate the lives of students that want to come to the EU from any place in the world. So after this big moment of submersion of my colleagues in the Commission and the European Union regarding what was called the 2015 crisis of the irregular arrivals, the reactions this was creating, the problems it was creating in member states. So after this, it was good, it was fortunate that we started to have a bit more of space to look at what we can do more on the legal migration part, on legislation, etc. So we are We have evaluated what we have, and we have now last week published the conclusions and are now launching another round of consultations about this. But we thought we could try to do something also with specific countries that now only have, at least at EU level, because we know that at member states there are some bilateral agreements, there are some privileged relations with specific countries, and this comes from history and is more than natural. But at EU level, what could we do to treat more favorably some member states that have specific needs or with whom we need to have a management of migration that is more positive? How can we help here? We cannot impose things on member states because, you know, some member states have very different approaches and relation with migration, at least from some countries, because some of them have a lot of migrants but coming from other regions of the world. And so we propose to member states to help us to find out what we could do to offer something which is more positive to some privileged partners. Some member states showed up, around 12, others didn't. And among these 12, we developed with them this concept that now Rafaela referred, the pilot projects, which already had a huge inspiration on what Germany was doing, the triple win strategy, the skills partnership, what GIZ is doing, and was presented here. So what can we do? So we first do as normally for the Commission, proposed to help financially there. We propose to help technically via the ICMPD, which is managing part of these projects and that can help member states to build the projects and make them in line with what are the objectives here. And we could keep on pushing member states to coordinate. So this is not something that comes naturally. There are naturally some reluctance from one member state or the other. They want to have their package for themselves. They want to have their migrants there to stay there. I've heard in the discussions when we were doing the consultations on our legal migration, some member states saying, no, we don't want intra-EU mobility. We want our migrants to stay in our place because we had all the trouble to get them, to get the permits, to train them. We don't want now them to go to some country X where they get better payment or better perspectives or some. So they are stuck here with us even if we don't propose them anything special. So this is life. We are all humans, so we have this kind. So we have been pushing member states to coordinate. We have organized several member states with those that are interested to do it, so we are not imposing anything on anybody. And I think personally, I came into the project a bit late, but I think we have managed to create some links, some communication between member states. We were able to get the enthusiasm of some member states, notably Belgium with Rafaela. We have also a big project financed by another instrument, which is the EU Trust Fund with the GIZ that will be helping the GIZ also to upgrade its intervention with some partner countries. And we had other surprising projects. For instance, we had a very surprising project of Lithuania with Nigeria, which is a couple I would not obviously think about it. And we have other projects with France and with Spain that are now just being launched. On the sides, we have also thought, because for this facility we have financial, which is the Mobility Partnership Facility, projects needed to be presented by member states, so by authorities, or at least supported by the authorities. So on the side, we also open with another instrument a call for proposals for civil society to come up with ideas of this. This was done, so we received around 15 projects in this call. We are now finalizing the evaluation. Unfortunately, the package we have will only be, it will only be possible to finance a few of them, but these are different, so this will not be something promoted by the agencies, the ministries, etc., but by civil society or international organizations. We'll see. We are really in the first steps of this. We are negotiating now a new package, a new budget for being able to support more member states' projects this year. These are supposed to be pilot projects, so indeed these are new ideas. This should test innovative approaches. We are trying to convince structures and authorities that were not used to this approach to test it with partner countries. We are having difficulties to reach some countries, so it goes in the line of what was said here. For instance, we had Niger as a priority country. Nobody came up with a project with Niger, and I'm not surprised. It surely is a difficult partner to build something like this. Same for Ethiopia or for other countries. So currently, what is the situation, to update you? So we have already, let's say, this EU Trust Fund project that is now starting in the next weeks to come. We have 4 smaller projects like the one that Rafaela has just presented, supported by the Mobility Partnership Facility. We will launch probably 1 or 2 more projects financed under the AMIF, and we will continue to discuss with member states what else can we do, how they can participate, coordinate more in the projects that are ongoing, and if they are able to present more. We hope, like Rafaela, that in 1 year or 2 years we can stop a bit and evaluate what was done. At the same time, we really hope to have more countries involved, so third countries with partnership to do this with 1 or 2 member states. And we are also reflecting internally with the new commission, what can we propose? Should we make this something more larger, with a larger scope, with more financing? So this is a discussion which is ongoing, and I don't think we'll have an answer very soon for you, but your contributions and your views would also be welcome here. For the moment, I would say that if we could find a way to get more member states involved with partner countries which are less obvious to receive this kind of because I didn't mention, but most projects are now covering Morocco, Tunisia, and then there are 2 that are also covering Egypt. But if we can reach out to sub-Saharan countries and try to find ways to develop this kind of approach with them, it would be great and a good challenge for the months to come. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you, Alexander, for this elaborate update. I think I heard 2 things which I briefly comment on. One was that you mentioned Lithuanian, which you said was kind of an odd match. I'm not an expert in Lithuanian labor market issues, so I don't know if it's an odd match. But I think it illustrates quite well that it's not just a German-Belgian issue, this one, German-Belgian Dutch issue. It's also a Lithuanian issue. It's also a Polish issue, actually. So there are many member states looking at this. The second thing I take away is that there is the usual kind of commission wants to facilitate things, and member states wants to play, but also not really want to play. So, and I don't expect you to solve this overnight. So that's my takeaway. Michael, could you spend a few minutes, because I think what we've heard also is skill partnerships will not be a magic bullet, for sure. I'm not saying you have ever said that. There's definitely more need for innovation. It's difficult, but countries are interested. So if you could spend 3-4 minutes before we open for questions, giving some thoughts on where we could see innovation going in this area of facilitating labor migration. I know it's unprepared, but here you go.
I mean, I think a great way to see the need for innovation is to gaze at its gaping black opposite, and that is my country. whose leadership on the issue of migration is something I just don't have adjectives to describe in polite company. It's a total failure. The government is preparing to seal the US-Mexico border as we speak, which is so far from a solution to the great challenges there that I'm at a loss for words. Where did that come from? What gave political legitimacy to the demagogue that is running the United States right now to take actions of that kind? The seeds were planted by past policy failures. So you saw those graphs that Mattia and I put up. Think about it's 1977. There are 100,000 apprehensions at the border every year, which is really large. That's what it's on track to be this year. They're Central Americans this time. At that time, it was Mexicans. And somebody proposes, you know, there could be a constructive way for this to happen. A lot of these Mexicans are going to make an enormous economic and fiscal contribution, to say nothing of a cultural contribution to the United States. We really need to innovate lawful channels for this mutually beneficial exchange to happen. Michael Clemens comes and says that when he's 5 years old in 1977, and somebody reasonably says to him, you know, that's going to take an enormous amount of work and entirely new international treaties and categories of visas and new organizations and new private-public partnerships. That's a whole lot of hard work. How are you going to scale that up? Something scaled, and it was what Land Pritchett calls the world's wackiest guest worker program. And it's that several years later, it was 1.8 million apprehensions a year at the same border. So something scaled up by 18 times, and it was something that was so drastically harmful compared to what it could have been at that time, and remains harmful to this day in that the presence of those people without status in the US is something that people, I think, were understandably upset about, and created a huge opportunity for a con man to convince a large portion of the US electorate that the problems that they face, very real problems, were the fault of those people. That's a very simplistic account of the support for Donald Trump, but it is, I think, unquestionably a substantial part of it. He opened his campaign about this issue, and it remains the bread and butter of his political support. That's a drastic, drastic failure. The question wasn't whether labor mobility between Mexico and the US was going to scale up or not. That was baked in by demographic forces that are far beyond the ability of any politician, any development agency, any border patrol officer to fundamentally alter, although there are important roles for all of those people in shaping it in a positive way. The fundamental policy decision was, are we going to do the hard work of building it wasn't, are we going to tear down the wall or not? It was, are we going to do the very difficult long-term work of building constructive doors in the wall for mutually beneficial exchange? And that's just not something that can be done in a single administration. It's something that nobody knows how to do. It's going to be the work of a generation. It's going to require a whole lot of pilot projects, many of which fail, frankly. And like all bold innovation, I don't see another alternative to it. I think that Europe has the opportunity now to do vastly, vastly better than the US did, or follow a similar path.
Thanks a lot, Michael. I think we should open to some questions. So why don't we take 3 or 4 questions to start with? Malte, will you give the microphone, please?
Good morning, and thank you very much. My name is Augusta, and I'm a researcher at the University of Turin, and I'm visiting fellow here at CEPS. The question that I have is about the methodology to design this kind of policy, and is somehow inspired by the ODI report that came out to comment on the result of the the Jordan Compact for Syrian refugee to create job opportunities there. And one of the results that the ODI researcher pointed out was that it would have been better, let's say, to involve refugee voices in the designing of the policy. So I'm wondering whether this can be done in this kind of skill partnership with bilateral agreement?
Yes, thank you. Eliodoro Temprano from the European Commission. I find all these schemes very interesting and very welcome, but I wonder, I mean, to some extent for them to work, I mean, it seems like provided there's the financing and these training schemes work, then the legal pathways open automatically, no? And my question is, do not these schemes assume that the member states are going to be giving more visas, more work permits, etc.? The other thing I wanted to ask is, can we not learn from the guest worker programs of the 60s and 70s? We have mentioned it several times in this discussion, but I mean, they worked. Maybe they were more relying on the training provided by the companies, but I mean, maybe a bigger role of the private sector is invisible. And finally, my other comment is, I wonder whether, just as these schemes also can benefit training not for migrants, can they also not be beneficial in terms of facilitating legal migration, for example, within Africa? Because we have a policy of supporting intra-regional migration, which still accounts for 70–80% of total migration from Africa. So, of course, it could be beneficial for them. Also, from our defensive, protectionist, traditional EU point of view, it can be seen as an alternative, of course, to migration to the EU. So I just wonder whether it could also be beneficial to support legal migration within the continent. Thank you.
Marco Funk with the Friedrich Hebert Foundation Brussels office. Thank you very much for the very interesting input. I was just wondering, one thing that I don't fully understand with these schemes is how the people are chosen in the country of origin, because I could imagine that there would be a race for, the people that most people would want to take advantage of this training to come to Europe because they can increase their income drastically. So by participating in these programs and coming. But so what I don't understand is if training is provided to not only potential migrants but also people who will stay in their country, on what basis will the selection be carried out of the people who will stay and the people who will come to Europe? Is it maybe the best of each class that is allowed to come to Europe, or is there a lottery system or something? Because I think that's a fundamental aspect that that will drive that will lead to a success or failure of these kind of schemes. Thanks.
Should we take one more?
Thanks. Lalana from PICUM. It's the Platform for Undocumented Migrants. I was wondering if we could go a bit more into what the rights of the workers are who do participate in these schemes and do migrate. You mentioned benefits in terms of income and things, but something that was quite important in a couple of your presentations was that this can be long-term migration. And it doesn't need to be return migration or somehow restricted. And so are people really getting long-term permits? Do they have the right to change employer? Do they have the right to change sector even after a period of time? So we see a lot of potential exploitation when there are these 6-month contracts. I mean, one of the pilots in the UK at the moment is, I don't think it's under one of these skills partnerships, but it's for horticulture and agriculture, and we're seeing 0-hour contracts, 6 months permits, no access to public funds, requirements on health insurance, like all the onus being put on the worker, so really placing them in a situation where exploitation can thrive. So could you say a bit more about what really are the kind of permits and work opportunities that are being provided to the workers under these schemes? And then maybe building on the comment from the first question, was I understand also one of the key things in the German and Philippines nursing bilateral agreement was also the involvement in the trade unions in developing the agreement. So when you're talking about these quadri, partri, or 6, all the different agencies involved in developing it, where are the migrant workers and the workers' representatives in those discussions? Thanks a lot.
So I think in order to manage at least one more round of question, I will kind of delegate the question here in the panel. And of course, if panelists want to comment on the other question, that's good. But I will slightly rephrase the first question, if you don't mind, Augusta, to simply ask, how could refugees be included in these skill partnerships? Sorry? migrants. And I would like to pass that to you, Marta. So how could refugees and migrants be better included in skill partnership schemes? Is that probably? It would seem that if the skills training is there, then the demand is there. So is it simply a matter of having more visas and work permits? And maybe I can give that to you, Alexander, and maybe also to you, Rafaela. I would also like to give to Rafaela. Sorry, I got a bit lost here. Yeah, to Rafaela and to the gentleman from DIZ. Sorry, now Tillman. Sorry, yeah. How are people chosen, and who should actually go? I think that's a very relevant countries who should go to the EU once the training is over. To Marta and Michael, I would like to address the issue of training to migrate within Africa. I think Marta, you briefly commented upon that when you spoke. A bigger role for the private sector. That's maybe you, Rafaela. Rights of migrants. I think I will give that to the Commission, to Alexander. And the role of trade union, I will also give to you, Rafael. I think that's, yeah. I think I have somewhat equally distributed the questions. Tillman, can I ask you to start, please? And sorry for forgetting your name.
I will try to answer two then of the questions. Maybe to start with your question about the home track and the abroad track, how people are chosen. Well, so far it was very interesting for us that at least in these countries where we are currently working, there is not such a strong pressure on the abroad track. Because if you at the same time really invest in an increase of the level of skills development in the countries of origin, they also have the option to find interesting jobs within their countries that where they didn't have the opportunity before. So, for example, working for international firms investing in the countries, and what we learned is that there is still a strong tendency to rest in the country where your family lives, where your friends are, and so on. So, but this is specifically the case for countries like Vietnam and Serbia, and we can probably not just easily say that it will be the same in Niger or Mali or whatever. So this is one of the main reasons why I said we have to be very careful in order to just translate the experiences that we have so far to other countries. I really think that we should invest a little bit more time into evaluating what we have done so far, and to really develop a proper prototype where we can tell clearly what are the outcomes before coming to the scaling up. So this is one of our main discussions also with DG Home at the moment, that we would be a little bit more reluctant in immediately transferring the approach to other countries. The same is true on the technical level, where we have carefully chosen. I mean, the colleagues from Belgium have chosen the ICT sector. We have chosen the healthcare sector. I mean, this makes sense because these are sectors where we have quite advanced levels in some of our partner countries. But we don't know anything about what that means for example, mechatronic experts in Nigeria. So also when it comes to professions and sectors, we have to be very careful to what extent all the experience can be translated. Maybe a last element also on the involvement of the migrants into the design of the system. Within our approach, we call our approach triple win approach, not just win-win approach, because there is from the beginning the involvement of the individuum. meaning that we try to do capacity development with the public employment services in the countries of origin in order to develop structures that can really consult the potential migrants to identify the right way for their career, which might also end up by advising them to go into a completely different training scheme or track on the labor market. So this is basically the idea that we really also need to capacitate the existing structures when it comes to career guidance and so on. I mean, this is not, of course, the involvement in the overall scheme, but at least it's a clear perspective on the individual needs.
May I give the word to Rafaela to kind of from the practitioner side, then we come back to you, Marta.
So I will pick up on what Tilman was saying. How do you select? How do you involve? How do you protect? If I can summarize. So how do you involve? It is the most difficult part, because when you design the quadripartite, you can easier identify your stakeholders. How do you identify potentially interested workers in a certain sector in Morocco and in Flanders? We went about it through consultation with Moroccan diaspora organization and professional organizations in Belgium, for instance, trying to understand from the links they have with fellow organizations and individuals in Morocco and in Belgium. You might know, if you are familiar with Brussels, that it exists a Moroccan organization of ICT workers in Brussels called Molengeek. So you have fellow people you can involve in the discussion. So this was done. I am happy that we comply with ODI standards. How do you select? So selecting is key and it's challenge. The key is clearly defining the entry criteria, so who can apply to start the whole process of trainings, and this is done in the quadripartite cooperation, so the two national regional employment agencies with the representatives of the private sectors, chambers of commerce, but also with the representative of specific corporations in the ICT sectors, both in Morocco and in Belgium. So the entry criteria, what do you need to have to apply? And the selection is done based on very strict criteria that are common in Belgium and in Morocco, starting from the skills profiles that these four have established together. But then who decides, who selects those that are employed by a company in Morocco and a company in Belgium are the four. Interviews dates are organized in Morocco, where Belgian company go or are present themselves via Skype or via video conference. Moroccan companies go. The two employment agencies mediate. So it is a protected process, but still a market process. The companies will issue vacancies. Those who are trained apply for the vacancies, and normal job interviews will happen with the mediation of the two agencies, which is a way to already protect migrants, because indeed the minimum that the employers can offer is a 6-month contract, but there are no other limits. They can offer 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, open-end contract. So it's not a circular migration scheme per se. Return can happen or cannot happen. So in order to get a visa to enter Belgium, the future employee need to have their employment contract in their hands. And this is another element, the partnership with all the actors in Belgium, in the Foreign Affairs and the Interior Affairs, to make the regional, federal, international machine work. The protection, it is also done not only by having both employment agencies checking the contract that is offered and all the conditions that are stated in the contract, but also because in the board of the regional employment agency in Belgium, trade unions are represented. One. Second, another actor is the regional agency for integration in Flanders, the Agentschap Integratie in Burgering, that will be giving pre-departure life skills training to all the group, specific life skill training to all the groups, specific pre-departure training to for those who are selected to travel, and which will be also involved in giving integration training once people are in Belgium. And among the issue in the curricula for integration, there is also a module on protection of labor rights and a follow-up for the first 6 months, because this indeed is a project. So you cannot follow the entire life of the person in Belgium, but at least the transition is protected. Bigger involvement of the private sector and need for evaluating the prototype. Just 2 words on this, because this indeed is key, and this is why we have decided to embed a research component in the pilot, even if it is a pilot, so it's small scale, small in all senses. We esteem that just a final evaluation, which will happen anyway, would not be enough. Therefore, a group of researchers from the Université Catholique de Louvain is following the project since before it starts. We have set 3 lines, so socio-economic impact, so employability before, after, legal aspects, so how does pilot project differ from other guest workers and other labor migration models that have existed in the past or that exist in other countries? What are the advantages, what are the shortcomings, and integration outcomes? So is a pilot project that is involving the quadripartite plus fit for purpose, etc., etc. And yes, indeed, exactly as I started from, indeed, we are seeking the involvement of the private sector since the very beginning, exactly as Germany does, because the idea, indeed, is that you need a little push to go for it. You need the community push, you need the willingness of the state to push, but it needs, the central role needs to be played by the national employment agencies and by the private sector itself.
Marta, on the training to mobility within Africa, you briefly spoke about it in the introduction, but I guess there would also be issues with development cooperation going to, say, Nigeria and say we would like to make a program to train people so that they're able to move to say, Nigeria. Could you say something about the challenges as well?
Okay, let me take first the question on users, and I'll come to that. So, Michael will have a lot more to say about specifically involving users in the Global Skills Partnership. But this idea that you involve those who are meant to benefit or to be involved in a particular innovation as a way to ensure that it's fit for purpose is, if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense, and is what we have learned through practices in so many areas. And I mean, in the case of the Jordan Compact, we tried to look at what the experience was and move away from this notion about whether we conclude already whether it worked or not, to try to understand a little bit the process that led to it and the specific aspects of the experiment that worked well. And in that case, having a very specific target group about Syrian refugees in particular camps, the fact that they were not sufficiently involved in further iteration of the compact is certainly something that could improve in the future. But this actually leads me to maybe a more general consideration. Maybe we should actually stop talking about these things as pilots, because something as a pilot almost assumes that once the pilot, you demonstrate the pilot works, then it's a matter of scaling it up and going global or going big. Here, I think it's much more important to think about the designing innovation in ways that can actually learn from its own application and adapt to what seems to be working, and be very upfront about what doesn't work, move on and try something different. So it's not about finding the pilot that works so that we finally got the trick, but much more, because we are in it in the long run, to design these innovations in ways that stand the test of time by continuing to be to evolve and adapt and be flexible. An interesting thing about the job compacts is that as they're now being trialed in Ethiopia, there is a lot more awareness of some of these lessons learned from Jordan and elsewhere, and consideration in the design about whether the match between the jobs and the skills and the aspirations of those that are meant to apply for those jobs are fit for purpose or not. Some people are being more optimistic than others about how carefully they'll be looked at. But the fundamental principle is not just that we adhere to the fact that is a good idea, we should pay attention to what migrants think and what, but also is what we need to learn from it to make sure that whatever we designed actually works in reality and can be adapted and we can learn from it. And that leads to another consideration, is that I didn't mean to, for a minute before, to disregard the importance of scale. I mean, the numbers at hand are clear. But perhaps every time we think about the scale of a problem, we need to consciously think about the time frame to address that. I mean, the problem with scale always, and particularly in Europe since 2015, always lends itself to a sense of emergency and crisis and something that needs to be done tomorrow to address something that otherwise we'll all be submerged with. And we know how damaging that was. This is about the long term. And politicians who are not thinking of winning elections next year, but have their eyes into a career in the next 20, should think about that scale, because it's something that is not going to go away. So every time we think about scale, let's think about what the time frame to address the scale. And let's not imagine that pilot projects can be obviously not the silver bullets, but what, how many of them, and how actually innovations in the fields of labor migration can, over time, turn the tide of what is today a complete political blockage to the notion of every formal legal pathways into something that pragmatically might work. And here, maybe it's a suggestion for actually the likes of us. Maybe we should consciously bring together what we're learning across the job compacts, what the private sector is learning on schemes on jobs for refugees, and global skills partnerships. So all these attempts to try to address the reality of mobility through the lens of market needs and labor, in terms of what are we all learning about doing this thing in a ways that, rather than any of those resolving the problems, actually collectively begins to create a different approach to how do we address the fundamental reality that people move where jobs are, and how do we make a better match between those things. Moving within Africa, I think the issue is not about, listen, we heard examples of countries and where some of the current experimentation of the global skills partnerships are occurring, and they're Morocco, Egypt, Kosovo, and we heard about Lithuania and Nigeria, and the desire to see more sub-Saharan Africa, and why this, Niger, which is a priority for the EU, has not come up, because Niger is a priority for very different political reasons. Niger is a priority in relation to smuggling and trafficking and trying to stop people in their track, which is a fundamental different proposition to work corporately with Morocco to help create jobs and actually facilitate the movement of Moroccans towards Europe. And I think that's the political reality that we're navigating. So the idea of working across African countries is that countries of origins, as in particularly low-income countries, where, as we've heard, migration goes hand in hand with development. So it's more likely that it is countries where development opportunities exist and the prospect of jobs is real, and where some of the existing training facilities can accommodate something, the Global Skills Partnership, where this particular kind of design can take root. So maybe this is something that should be specifically, or an element of it should be aimed at middle-income countries, emerging economies where those opportunities exist, and to be cognizant of the fact that these are not necessarily just for the nationals of those countries, but these countries are likely, Morocco I'm sure being an example, to be themselves host of migrants from the region. I don't see any problem in terms of development cooperation in investing in that way. At the end of the day, a country like the UK invests in Nigeria, including through development cooperation, or Ghana, also for the prospect of creating economic opportunities in Nigeria in ways that is, certainly the UK at the moment is very politically acceptable in ways that benefits the UK economy itself. And therefore, I don't see why, an element of training skilled migrants, workers in that country, cannot be an element of that nature of collaboration. It seems to me that we should maybe move away from the notion that this is a scheme for a country of origin and a country of destination. It's a scheme between labor markets that have skills gap and particular need, and countries that can provide, where there is a mutual benefit in addressing that skills gap through the local population, which in my view can be a combination of natives and migrants, particularly if those countries are emerging economies where a number of migrants from the regions happen to be. And also, it's nothing new that, again, I know the UK because I worked with DIFI for a long time. It's nothing new that the UK works with ECOWAS to facilitate labour mobility within West Africa as part of its effort to support regional integration. It's actually a quite healthy way of thinking of investing ODA not to stem migration, but to foster regional or local economic development in ways that can actually make the most of the reality of regional mobility. So I don't see it as in fact, it's more honest than trying to provide ODA to, I don't know, Mali with an attempt to create opportunities for Mali and sustain Mali. It seems to be that working with Morocco, Nigeria, and Ghana is a more realistic approach to achieve that.
Thanks a lot, Marta. We have 7 minutes left. That gives you 3 minutes, Michael, and 4 to Alexandra. So please.
Yes, very, very briefly. I wanted to mention new destinations, which the gentleman here, whose name I didn't catch, brought up. I think a critical sphere of innovation, in addition to the ones that we've talked about, is the active facilitation of new destinations. Craig McIntosh and Gordon Hanson are the economists who made this projection of 800 million net increase in sub-Saharan Africa's labor force by 2050. In the same paper, whose title is the Mediterranean the next Rio Grande, they estimate that if the sub-Saharan African population of Europe were to triple by 2050, that would represent about 0.5% of that increase. So I think there's a realistic numerical scenario where any feasible lawful channels to Europe are the sole way to address that. There are new opportunities for labor mobility for Africans to other parts of the world opening all of the time. For example, Japan is undergoing such extreme demographic change that they have overcome their political resistance and just opened a small pilot project of 300,000 guest workers from India who will be trained in technical vocational skills before migrating to go to Japan. Why did they need to be from India? Is it because they're Buddhist, because they speak Japanese? No. It's because the World Bank happened to negotiate that agreement. It could have been negotiated with Ethiopia. It could have been negotiated with West Africa. The EU or European development agencies that have a strong interest in facilitating migration for those people could have helped them find a different destination. And I think there's been almost no work of that kind, but that's another way in which we could innovate. I also want to just briefly mention your mention of the critical importance of portability of visas between employers. Some of the great disasters in temporary work programs in the past, I think, have had a lot of their basis in the fact that people had to choose between quitting and going home or staying and enduring whatever their employer was imposing on them, which is not a reasonable thing to impose on people. It led to drastic abuses. It's less of a concern in programs that involve permanent visas, because most permanent visas have portability baked in. But to the extent that these programs are temporary, it's absolutely critical that there needs to be portability. And countries have innovated in that way as well. Korea's guest worker program, some of which involves semi-skilled workers, allows you to quit twice. So it's not absolute portability, but you're not tied to a single employer. And you can, there is a legal way to overcome situations in which there's abuse of employees, which is very real. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Michael. Alexandra, I think I assigned to you the rights of migrants, so you could pick up from where Michael left. And I think there was one more thing I wanted you to talk about, but there you can pick and choose yourself.
Thank you. It's working, yeah. On the rights, yes. Well, I have to tell you, of course, this is a horizontal issue that covers all our legislation, and where I don't think that Europeans should be ashamed of themselves. I think we really have, with its limitations, its problems, we still compare nicely with other regions in terms of offering fair conditions or close to equal conditions for migrants. That comes from also what Rafaela mentioned from the single permit. And of course, there are implementation issues. There are things that can be done better, but I hope that at least the legal framework is sufficient, or is at least okay there. For these pilot projects, I have to tell Liliana, these are really small projects. This is not comparable with the UK schemes on seasonal workers, or even the Polish schemes with Ukraine, where we speak about thousands of people. These are really, we are speaking about 30 people or 50 people. And we didn't harmonize the approach. So we restricted ourselves, we controlled ourselves in our harmonization drive. And we left for member states to choose what they would be approaching. So in some cases there will be permits for work, like for Belgium, so they will be insured, rights will be insured there. But some schemes that we are financing, for instance, the one with France and with one in Spain, in fact there will not be a work contract, but mostly a work experience proposed, or a study and training experience proposed. So for instance, the French project will be a 6-month internship from the partner country, for people from partner countries in French companies that then that aim at completing their studies. So this is for graduate students, and to complete their training in the company, and also linked to the French universities, and then go back to the country if they wish so. There's no obligation, but that's not the purpose. So people are going there to finalize their studies, to have the stage that is part of their graduate study. And the promoters, the universities that are promoting this, they had already tested this, and people normally go and are recruited by the branches of the same companies in this country. So it's not something that entails, so people are paid, the project proposed a quite nice grant that the companies pay attention. It's not, we are not paying for companies to get people, so we are paying for other activities, for pre-departure, for preparation, for travel, some kind of help like this, but we are not replacing companies in paying for their workforce. And this is also the GIZ approach. And here, so you see, it's different. I cannot tell you, well, the issue of rights is there. The issue of involving the different partners, including trade unions if needed, depends a bit also of the nature of the project. For Rafaela, it's done because it's something that looks at integration in the labor market. For the French, I'm not so sure, but it's something that we can follow. And then when we speak, somebody else asked about the involvement, yes, it was SEPS. Are we involving migrants? For instance, this French project, for the selection of people and for reaching people, they are counting on a network of alumni. So people that did that already, that went through these internships and now are working in Morocco and Tunisia, will help the promoters to reach out to students, etc. So these people are involved. We also try to do this at our level, which is a much more, how I say, further from the ground, but we are doing, for instance, in the Migration Forum from tomorrow, we have some discussion with the representatives of the people that are there, that can be diaspora organization or NGOs, etc. And we are discussing what can we do there. So it's a good occasion also to have the views of everybody. So we try to reach out to have the input from migrants, from people that have already had experiences in this area. And well, let's follow up on this. As Marta said, we can call it pilot or something else, but we are really testing innovative projects, and hopefully something can come out of this that is helpful for at least those member states that have already quite an open mind about needing to do something about their labor markets and reaching out for I remember a colleague of Rafaela presented the circle. So first you look at your national labor force, then you look at the EU labor force, and then sometimes even after checking both, you still need to reach out. And so let's do it in a way that is positive for everybody and that really takes into consideration the needs of the partner countries also.
Thank you very much, Alexander. And let's finish on this, one of the last notes you said, so positive, innovative projects, and let's learn from what's going on out there. Let's give a big hand of applause to the panel. Thank you very much for coming.